Chris Mackowski of Emerging Civil War for the American Battlefield Trust, and we have been commemorating the 160th anniversary of the Battle of Chancellorsville. And we have been all over this tremendous battlefield, seeing some fantastic things, talking with some fantastic experts, and we've got one final video to wrap things up because we are at the pinnacle of battle. As we've discussed, Robert E. Lee has come out to meet the Federals here at Chancellorsville. Stonewall Jackson has gone on a deep, wide sweep to the end zone and come in, hitting the Federal Army on its right flank, rolling them up in this direction. He's killed, or excuse me, he's mortally wounded. In the midst of that, Jeb Stuart will take over. They'll reconfigure the Confederate position and then begin the big squeeze on Joe Hooker's position, which is in a large semicircle here around the Chancellorsville intersection. And as Stuart squeezes and Lee squeezes and they try to unite the Army, the Federals begin to run out of artillery ammunition in particular. And so the incessant slamming by the Confederates brings in such pressure that the Federals are going to have to start to withdraw and try to reestablish some sort of position where they can continue the fight. It's all hanging in the balance. Men have been falling every single second for hours. It's going to be the second bloodiest day of the entire American Civil War. And to put us in the middle of that combat, I'm going to ask my friend Kris White to come and join us.
Thanks, Chris. And we chose the hottest point of the day so that I could wear my sweatshirt that was designed by my friend Brad Wilson. This is not a Civil War Trust sweatshirt. This is from my reenacting unit, the 140th Pennsylvania, who fought right where we're standing. And in fact, my ancestor was about maybe 100 feet off of where we were standing right now, serving in the Chancellorsville Crossroads on May 3rd, 1863. It's one of his only two battles that he takes part in. He's mortally wounded at Gettysburg near the wheat field later on. But what's happening right now is just basically pandemonium. Behind me, you would see the Chancellor mansion that would have been standing here at the intersection. It is being struck multiple times by artillery shell fire. And as that artillery comes in, Joe Hooker himself will be standing beside a pillar on the second-story porch, split in two, and strikes him on the side. He's knocked unconscious and taken out the back door of the house, thought to be dead by many of the soldiers who see him. And as they take him, they will take him up the road, Elys Ford Road, which is right behind our camera, and they'll eventually take him to the opening where Catherine and Oscar Bullock's farm was here on the Chancellorsville battlefield. Tour stop 2 if you come down here to Chancellorsville. Over time, that building, which is full of wounded soldiers as well, will come under artillery fire because the Confederates will keep pushing from Hazel Grove up to Fairview and start converging more and more artillery fire into this position. Anyone who is down into this opening on the afternoon or on the late morning of May 3rd will be subjected to artillery fire coming in from basically 3 different points, converging artillery fire. So it's going to be coming in from all over. As that house starts to burn, we'll come back to that story in a moment, Robert E. Lee will start to push in from the east. As he starts to push in from the east, he is going to start to push back the skirmish line led by Nelson Miles, which was part of Winfield Scott Hancock's division, the 1st Division of the 2nd Corps. Hancock is not a corps commander yet, he's a division commander, and Hancock, when he will be down in this area, will actually lose his horse that was killed. He'll get a remount, and they said that his remount was so small because he was so big that his feet almost scraped along the ground, and he looked a little bit comical. But always in his white shirt that he was able to pull from no one knows where out of his wardrobe, he is out here and he is starting to move his division from left to right. He has to fight a rear guard because as the Chancellor House starts to burn, all of the wounded have to be evacuated, as well as at least 16 civilians are pulled out of the Chancellor House itself. One of my friend's ancestors, Thomas Henry, company commander of Company F, 140th Pennsylvania, went in the back door, went down in the basement, and he came out with one woman on one arm, one on another, and one hanging on his coattails as he went back towards United States Ford and Elys Ford Road. Unfortunately for the civilians who were pulled out of here, largely Joseph Dickinson of Hooker's staff gets the kind of the nod of approval, being the only guy saving people. He wasn't the only one saving these civilians. Unfortunately, the 16 civilians, when they come out here, will be subjected to artillery fire as well. One account talked about one woman exiting that house, losing her leg to an artillery shell almost immediately. Another struck in the side of the face. Another was killed outright. And yet another, a slave, will actually run off towards the Confederate lines and make it to Confederate lines. She was so scared to get out of this artillery inferno. But the house itself will start to burn to the ground. Wounded soldiers are extracted from that building. One man who had lost his leg, who was on the second story of that house, will crawl down the stairs himself. He will make it out into the yard where Confederates will eventually come into this crossroads and bring him into their care. Not one Union soldier will die in that fire, and no civilians will die in that fire either, but the house will burn. Hooker himself has been knocked out of action, and now there's really a call to start falling back to a new line that will be established to the north of us. But to get to that point, we have to deal with Robert E. Lee. On that side of the salient, Lee comes pushing in. As Lee is pushing in, the brigade of Paul Semmes starts to engage with that skirmish line of Nelson Miles. And two of the Union regiments will be actually left out in that field, because what will happen is they're going to start to try to defend three sides at once, and they start to lose track of some of their units. And one of the units is lost track of is the 27th Connecticut Infantry. If I'm the 27th Connecticut Infantry, I'm asking for my money back from this war. They're thrown against the stone wall at Marye's Heights. They are out here at Chancellorsville, where 8 of their 10 companies are captured by Willis C. Holt and his 10th Georgia Infantry, and then they enter the wheat field at Gettysburg. If you go to Gettysburg, though, you can follow their assault of all 75 men, monument by monument, all 5 of them, the most of one regiment on the field at Gettysburg. But they're a 9-month regiment. They saw some of the worst of the war. After the capture of the 27th, a artillery officer named Robert Stiles will ride past these prisoners, and one man will start to scream, "Bob Stiles, Bob Stiles." And it turns out it was somebody he had known from New Haven, Connecticut, when he taught a Sunday school class up there when he was a student at Yale. And these two men will meet here on the battlefield at Chancellorsville, and who will ride up, supposedly, according to Bob Stiles, is also Robert E. Lee. So we start to see that coming together, but that side of the salient will start to fall. In the meantime, Hancock will start to shift men over to us. Hancock will start to shift Zook's brigade under a guy named Samuel Kosciuszko Zook. He will bring his regiments over into this area. On the march to Chancellorsville, Zook and Winfield Scott Hancock were good friends. And Hancock, who has a mouth on him, got really upset at Zook for something that happened in the brigade. And Hancock started chewing him out, cursing up a blue streak, according to one of the officer's men. And Zook stood there and took it until Hancock ran out of air, according to this soldier, and then Zook gave it back to Hancock just as good as he had given it. And it was one of his favorite stories from the war, to talk about these two just cursing each other out, and then they kind of smiled and went on their way because they were good friends. Well, Zook's brigade will move into this area because we have artillery down in here, and some of the guns that would have been down in here rocking it out to that dude who's blasting some music would be the 5th Maine Battery E, led by George Leppin. Leppin will be ordered from the 1st Corps line down here into the Chancellorsville clearing. He said, well, one of the survivors said that they put their flank on the woods and then ran their line over to a peach orchard that was out here. When Leppin approached this position, he scouted it out ahead of time. He looked and he said, "I can get there, but to paraphrase him, it will take an act of God to get out of there." And in fact, Leppin never makes it down to this position alive. He goes back to bring his battery forward. He deploys them in line, and as they are deployed, the guns go live. They start firing out towards Fairview. The guns of the 5th Maine Battery E will be knocked out one by one by one, and down to the point where one of the guns is being manned just by 2 men, a corporal and a private. That private's named John Chase. Chase will be a recipient of the Medal of Honor for his actions here because he stood beside those guns for so long. The battery commander who took over for Leppin after he's killed, Lieutenant Kirby, he is also mortally wounded. But allegedly he said something along the lines of when he was pulled off the field that was one of the bravest acts that he had ever seen, Chase standing beside that gun, and he would make sure that he got a citation for that, for valor. And down the road, Chase is a Medal of Honor recipient. Fast forward to Gettysburg, and on July 3rd, 1863, he's at a place called Stevens Knoll today, McKnight's Hill, when an artillery shell exploded in front of him and he was hit 48 times. His right arm is carried away, his left eye, and he was left for dead because he fell over completely unconscious. About 2 days later, he's placed in a wagon out for burial when he wakes up. And his first words out of his mouth to the wagon master were, "Did we win the battle?" Chase, amazingly, at 20 years old, survives the war and all of his wounds. He lives until the age of 71 when he dies in Florida. He was an inventor. He invented a hoop skirt for women that collapsed. He also got into some streetcars and electricity by the time of the end of his life, but he went all around with one arm, one eye, and did all that inventing. And his Medal of Honor, as well as his cane, is here at Chancellorsville. It was received by the park in 2009 as a donation from the family. But these guns fall one by one silent. And to get them out of here, some of the men will see General Hancock riding along, and he will see that the battery is about to be captured because Confederates are coming in from all sides. And Hancock will ride over to the 140th PA and tell them to come over here and try to extract the guns. And one man said, in company with 25 comrades, companies D and H, and 5 from company C, Isaac Sharp and Captain Linton were first to seize the limber of one of the guns, and only by hard tugging did they raise it. As they lifted it, a shell passed under them, barely missing their feet. Woods Day seized a hold of a wheel of another gun when a shell exploded right under the gun, scattering earth and splinters and fire in every direction. John Sanders of Company D was killed. One of the caissons had 2 horses that could travel, and Joseph Evans saw this and mounted one of the horses in the hail of bullets and took the caissons out of here and saved it. Other men will come down here from the 53rd Pennsylvania, John Rutter Brooks' old regiment, and they'll start pulling off the guns. But in the end, a Harper's Weekly reporter was embedded with the Irish Brigade who was close by. He's going to claim that, hey, we saved all these guns, and it creates such a fervor between the 2 regiments that carries over into the post-war years where veterans on the battlefield at Gettysburg get into a fist fight with one another when they're putting their monuments on the field there. A battle that carried from here between veterans to Gettysburg into the post-war years. But Hancock and John White Gary, 2 Pennsylvania soldiers, will fight a rear guard action, shifting men from left to right, doing everything they can. Finally, word comes to Hancock that the last line has been established for Hooker, and they start pulling out of here. In the ashes of the Chancellor House, Confederates will start to come into this intersection from 2 different sides. And at that point, this is where we have Lee's greatest victory. There are still some problems that we have around here if we're Robert E. Lee, and I think Greg's going to talk about that in a moment. But now, the Confederates are now in their cavalcade of triumph as they come up into this intersection, pushing out all these Federals, but leaving behind just a wake of destruction over the last 5 hours.
So as the Federals pull back, they're going to create a fallback position around the Oscar Bullock Farm. I'm going to ask Steward Henderson to come in because he's got a little story to share as Lee's trying to create, or as Hooker's trying to create this last line. Of course, Hooker's knocked senseless, but instead of turning command over to Darius Couch, his second in command, he really is like, I want you to do this. He's not coherent enough, so he doesn't give Couch the freedom to really direct this withdrawal or reconsolidation in the way that Couch would see fit. So it's really a disservice to the Army that Hooker, not able to command and not willing to give command over, allows this fallback to happen. Fortunately, Couch and Hancock really manage things and prevent it from becoming a rout and keep it rather orderly. Steward.
I have often said that if General Hooker had stayed one more day, he would have won the Battle of Chancellorsville. And we have to remember, the army that wins at Gettysburg is the army that Hooker created here, but he's not going to be the commander then. General George Gordon Meade would be. But why do I say he would have won? And let me tell you this story. One of the best orders that Hooker gave on May 3rd was to establish a strong final defensive line. Had there been a serious renewal of the battle that afternoon, Charles Wainwright would have been in charge of the guns. How matters have gone is suggested by an incident about 3 p.m. Lee wanted to press the attack as the Union retreated into their final line of defense. General Lee sent Raleigh Colston forward on the U.S. Ford Road to probe the Federals' positions. And I quote, Lee said, "Don't engage seriously," he told them, "but keep the enemy in check and prevent him from advancing," end quote. Colston promptly encountered a terrific fire from Wainwright's massed guns and was sent reeling back. He counted 50 officers and men down in less than 2 minutes in one barrage. Yankee gunner Captain Stephen Wainwright noted in his diary, and I quote, "was moving about among his guns with actual delight, beaming on every feature of his face," end quote. Colston wisely advised Jeb Stuart that he could do no good in this position and promptly retreated. So that was just one quick section. In 2 minutes, he lost over 50 men. So if the Confederates would have attacked that last line, they probably would have lost this battle.
So, and you know, Kris White frequently likens this action to the Chihuahua keeping the Rottweiler in check, because Lee's going to have diminished forces here, particularly because he's going to have to split them in a few minutes to contend with an advance coming from the east. But as Lee first comes into this intersection, as Chris mentioned a few moments ago, it's this moment of triumph for him. There's a lot on his mind, a lot happening. And to paint the picture for us, I'm going to ask Greg Mertz to come back on. Greg's a former historian here at the Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park.
So the scene as Robert E. Lee rode into the Chancellorsville intersection is described in part by one member of his staff. And the staff member noted that the Chancellorsville house was burning. There were able-bodied soldiers moving into this area. There were wounded men yet on the ground. And as they saw Robert E. Lee ride in at this victorious moment, they could not help but cheer. So this cheer went up from the able-bodied as well as feeble a voice as those that were wounded on the ground could give. And the staff officer happened to ponder that, and he said he couldn't help but reflect on that moment being related to men of ancient times rising to the dignity of gods. And the novel and movie Gods and Generals got its title from that particular staff officer's description of this scene, Lee riding in among his victorious troops. Shortly after that, probably in this same area, Robert E. Lee got a couple of other messages that would be of importance and of interest. One is a message from Stonewall Jackson. Jackson has woken up in his field hospital and felt the need to formally write a note letting Robert E. Lee that he was no longer in command of his corps. Lee would write back telling Jackson that the victory here at Chancellorsville was due in large part to him, and Jackson would comment on that, saying that General Lee is too gracious, that he should give the praise of this victory to God. Another message that Lee would have received here in this vicinity was what was going on further toward the east. He had learned that John Sedgwick, off in Fredericksburg, had been able to push aside the body of Confederates that were in front of him along the same stone wall where the main Battle of Fredericksburg had been fought several months earlier, and was now marching out from Fredericksburg toward the position here at Chancellorsville. And Lee made a very fateful decision at that moment. The main Army of the Potomac that he had been dealing with for 3 days here, in which he had seen either retreat or being driven from their positions throughout those 3 days, he did not deem as dangerous as a smaller body of soldiers that had just gained the most substantial victory of the Federals in the Chancellorsville campaign at what we would call Second Fredericksburg, is now moving aggressively toward him. So he broke off the action here, turned to Jeb Stuart, told him to keep Jackson's command here and watch after that main army up to the north of us. And Lee would take at first on May 3rd a portion of the army to the east, and then the next day would take even more on off to the east to head off John Sedgwick. There, once again, the Union Army had created an opportunity of sorts for the Confederates. Lee now had to the east of Chancellorsville about as many men as the Union Army had under John Sedgwick. Plus, Lee was able to gain a position where he had 3 divisions that basically one on his far right, facing westward, one on his far left facing eastward, another one at the bottom facing to the north, a U-shaped line that could get potentially the Union forces in a crossfire. Lee thought he had a great opportunity, but on May 4th, he's very disappointed by the role of Lafayette McLaws, the troops that were on his far left, and the Union Army was basically able to retreat back across the river. Lee would bring his army back out here. We've already heard some mention of it, hoping to finish off the Union forces, but the Union Army had retreated back across the river in this section of the battlefield as well. But many people look at the Battle of Chancellorsville solely from the standpoint of the fighting at Chancellorsville proper. To look at the campaign, it's also very important that we consider that action right after Chancellorsville to the east, where Robert E. Lee felt his men had a great opportunity. Chancellorsville would be labeled as Robert E. Lee's greatest victory, and there was good reason for calling it that, but if you were to talk to Lee at the moment the Chancellorsville campaign was over, he would have been disappointed that he was not able to destroy the forces under John Sedgwick east of Fredericksburg.
Now, of course, Greg Mertz mentions the forgotten front of the Chancellorsville campaign, and that seems to me like a cue to bring on my co-author, Kris White, to talk a little bit about 2nd Fredericksburg and Salem Church.
This will just be a moment or two, but Greg brought up a couple good points. One thing he said was Lee not happy about this victory. He said, at Chancellorsville, we gained another victory. Our people were wild with delight. I, on the contrary, was made more depressed than after Fredericksburg. Our loss was severe, and again, we had gained not an inch of ground, and the enemy could not be pursued. So that would give you one idea there. But one of the things that Greg brought up was Robert E. Lee reacting and splitting the army again, and I think this goes back to knowing your enemy. And let me read a quote to you from George McClellan, the former Army of the Potomac commander, to give you an idea what he thought about Robert E. Lee. And then I'll read one from Robert E. Lee about John Sedgwick. He'll say that McClellan will say, "I prefer Lee to Johnston," referring to Joe Johnston, who was wounded in the Battle of Fair Oaks or Seven Pines. "The former is too cautious and weak under grave responsibility. Personally brave and energetic to a fault, he is wanting in moral firmness when pressed by heavy responsibility, and is likely to be timid and irresolute in action." He went on to say, "Lee will never venture upon a bold movement on a large scale."
Oops.
Can't read your enemy, can you? Here's this is what Lee says about John Sedgwick. Sedgwick was under Lee's command in the old army. The chaplain of the 17th Mississippi came riding into Lee's headquarters, hell for leather, panicked that 2nd Fredericksburg was happening and Marye's Heights had fallen. And Lee actually tells this man named Brother William to go sit on a log and wait for a few minutes. He comes over to him after he's calmed down. This guy tells him his tale of woe, and this was Lee's response. When the chaplain finished, Lee calmly said, "I am very obliged to you. The major is a nice gentleman. I don't think he would hurt us very badly, but we are going to see about him at once." He's not referring to Major General John Sedgwick as Major General. He's calling him a major from the old army. And he can read between the lines of who this guy is and how much time he has. But the only thing I'll add on is the one thing that Lee underestimated in this moment was the damage done to his army here at Chancellorsville. McLaw's division, who will eventually send out in that direction, and others, had fought for the last few days. There's no steadying hand. James Longstreet's not on this field. Jeb Stuart has to deal with all the mess around here. And then, of course, Stonewall Jackson has been wounded. So I think Lee underestimates the ability of his army after he brings home victory here on May 3rd and now starts to go downhill for this army all the way towards Appomattox.
Now, Greg invited us a second ago to think about loose ends. And, of course, one loose end is riding around with a bunch of horses to the south. And that would be George Stoneman. And if we're going to talk about Federal Cavalry, that means we're going to have Dan Davis do it. Dan?
Thanks, Chris. Now, we talked in some of our earlier videos about what Hooker's plan was for his cavalry during the campaign. And similar to the Battle of 2nd Fredericksburg and Salem Church, the fate of the Union cavalry is somewhat of a forgotten chapter within the context of the Chancellorsville campaign. George Stoneman with the divisions of David Gregg and William Woods Averill are going to cross the Rappahannock River mid to late April. Stoneman is going to take Gregg along with John Buford's reserve brigade and essentially go on a rampage across central and southeastern Virginia, raking havoc to Lee's lines of supply and communication. Averill himself is going to ride around a little bit out to the west, out in Culpeper County, before he will be recalled by Hooker back here to the main army. And on May 3rd, while the fighting is raging around us, Hooker's going to bring Averill's division, or elements from Averill's division, across the Rapidan at Elys Ford, and he's going to deploy them out here in these fields behind the infantry, behind the artillery, to act as file closers for the main position. Not the best use of your cavalry. The following day, William Woods Averill is going to be relieved from command by Joseph Hooker. Also, the person who will be relieved from command by Hooker just several days later is George Stoneman. Stoneman will eventually return to the safety of the north bank of the Rappahannock. Interestingly enough, it is some of his troopers who will cut the rail line south of Fredericksburg, stranding Stonewall Jackson at Guinea Station as he is en route to a hospital in Richmond. And also, interestingly enough, Stoneman and Jackson have been cadets together, classmates together at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. But going back to our earlier video, Hooker had issued a series of rather confusing and muddled orders to Stoneman before the campaign got underway, and I challenge you to go back and take a look at those communications between Hooker and Stoneman. And Hooker is going to point the finger at Stoneman, among other officers here at Chancellorsville, for his defeat at the hands of Robert E. Lee. Stoneman will in fact take a leave of absence and leave the Army of the Potomac several days after the end of the campaign, never to return. He will be replaced by the consummate self-promoter Alfred Pleasanton. But what Hooker doesn't know in his removal of Stoneman, his removal of Averill, and how he's employed his cavalry is he has provided a blueprint for how cavalry is to be utilized both in the Eastern and Western theater. A mounted strike force operating behind enemy lines or operating independently for the remainder of the war. Chris?
Now, aside from George Stoneman, of course, Oliver Otis Howard will prove to be a convenient scapegoat. After all, it's his 11th Corps that collapses on the flank and allows Jackson to drive the army into a defensive position. And John Sedgwick will likewise prove to be a convenient scapegoat. After all, he comes up in this direction and he is rebuffed by Lee and sent across the river. Never mind that Hooker's got a much larger force here. Never mind that he was supposed to be the hammer and Sedgwick the anvil, and he switches those roles on Sedgwick and orders Sedgwick to do all sorts of things that are well beyond his ability to do in the time frame he has available. And so these scapegoating things will happen. Hooker's going to look for a way to try to make sense of what happened to here, because his plans were perfect. Remember, as he launched this campaign, his plans were perfect. And for things to go so wrong is so shocking. To talk a little bit about Hooker's frame of mind and what his options are, I'd like to bring on Don Pfanz, former historian here at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park.
Chancellorsville had been pretty rough on Joe Hooker. By May the 3rd, he's reeling back in retreat. And again, his only thought is to save the army. Meanwhile, of course, Robert E. Lee has had to split his army yet again to go take care of John Sedgwick, which we've just heard about. On May the 4th and May the 3rd, Hooker can hear as fighting erupts off to the west, where Sedgwick is now battling Confederate forces over near Salem Church. One of his subordinates will come in to his headquarters and will say, "Hey, General, you know, it's obvious that Lee has turned his attention on Sedgwick. Now would be a good time for us to move forward and strike Lee in the rear." At which point Hooker said, well, I'm going to give them one more day to attack me, and if they don't, well, they better watch out. Typical Joe Hooker. Well, the next day passed. Hooker once again did nothing. Sedgwick, meanwhile, is being driven back across the Rappahannock, leaving Hooker's force as the only one for Lee now to attack. Hooker at this point will now call a council of war to decide what should we do. He's now got a very strong V-shaped defensive line just about a mile or half a mile or so in front of me. And the question was, should he stay and defend that line or should he retreat? Well, Hooker made it very clear at this council of war what his preference was. Gathering his corps commanders around him, he said that Sedgwick was now retreating back across the river, so that Lee would now be concentrating solely on the rest of the army, and that his main objective, as given to him by the president, was not to defeat Lee, but to defend Washington, D.C. So having said that, he said, I leave it now to you, gentlemen, to discuss amongst yourself what we should do. Should we stay and fight, or should we retreat? The officers got together, spoke for a little while, and concluded by a slight majority vote that they should stay and fight it out. When Hooker came in, they gave him their verdict, at which point Hooker said, thank you, gentlemen, we'll be retreating tomorrow night. At which point a very tired John Reynolds shook his head and muttered as he went out the door. He said, if he knew what he was going to do already, why did he invite us here at this time of night? Well, the next day, as Lee is now trudging back toward Chancellorsville to take care of Joe Hooker is now preparing to retreat back across the river. Hooker, during this time, the rain now starts to come down. It wasn't just a slight rain or a medium rain, it was a deluge. For several hours, the rain just poured cats and dogs across the countryside, causing the river in Hooker's rear to rise several feet. In fact, it rose so much that he's going to have to take one of his 3 pontoon bridges over here at U.S. Ford, dismantle it in order to increase the size of the other 2, because now they're getting too small to ford that river. So with this going on, Joe Hooker's going to disappear to take care of details in the retreat. And at that point, having crossed the north side of the river, Hooker, who's just worn out from the campaign, will take a short nap, and nobody's able to find him. When this is reported back to Darius Couch, the second in command of the army, Couch is going to take advantage of that to seize command, and he's going to order the troops, which are now already starting to retreat toward those bridges, to halt, turn around, and reman the trenches. Couch is going to stay and fight it out. Unfortunately for the Union Army, Hooker awoke an hour or so later, found out what Couch had done, and immediately countermanded Couch's orders and said, let the retreat continue. So in the very, very early morning hours of May the 6th, the Union Army is now again trudging toward the rear, toward those 2 remaining bridges of this flooded river. In advance of them go the supply wagons and supply mules. Also goes the artillery. So by just before dawn, you've got crowds of thousands upon thousands of Union soldiers packed into the crossing, waiting to get across the river. The army's now divided. Part of them have already crossed, part of them are waiting to cross. They've left their defenses. They don't have their artillery with them. And what would have happened, I ask you, it had a large tree come floating down this flooded river, struck the upper pontoon bridge, smashed it, and then the bridge floated down, struck the second bridge, and smashed that in pieces too. Just as Robert E. Lee would be ready to attack the following morning, Hooker would have been trapped with his army divided out of its trenches with its back to the Rappahannock River. In my view, the Army of the Potomac never came closer to being annihilated than it did on that morning. But as it turns out, the bridges did hold. Hooker did get his troops across the river, and the next morning when Robert E. Lee troops move forward, they find empty trenches, and the Union forces now cutting loose the bridges and going across the river. Lee was furious at this. Lee wanted to destroy the Union Army, not simply defeat them. And when Dorsey Pender comes back to him and reports that the Federals have evacuated their trenches or are heading for the river, Lee was just furious. He says, that's the way you young men always do. You let them get away. Go after them, he said. Punish them all you can. But it was too late. The Federals were across. Lee had won a great victory, perhaps the greatest of his career, but the Union Army had gotten away. And as we see, Lee knew that and was not very satisfied with the result. Joe Hooker was also not very satisfied with the result. He'd come across here with such great hopes and had now basically retreated back across the river with his tail between his legs. Everybody who, in the high command at least, knew how badly Hooker had done. Hooker tried to spread the blame around, as Chris just described, but everybody knew that it was Hooker's fault. Certainly those in the know were aware of that. In fact, on every day of the campaign, starting with April the 30th, you can pick out a mistake that Hooker made that had he just done one different thing, he could have won a great victory here. On April the 30th, he halted here instead of moving out of the wilderness. On May 1st, he gave up the initiative and fell back to Chancellorsville. On May 2nd, he allows Lee to turn his right flank. On May 3rd, he begins retreating. Instead of reinforcing Hazel Grove, he falls back here to the Chancellorsville Crossroads. And of course, on May the 4th, he remains complacent back behind his defenses while letting John Sedgwick take a beating out here at Salem Church. And then on May 5th, he retreats instead of simply holding his ground and letting Robert E. Lee attack him. And Lee would have attacked him, I'm confident of that. Anybody who looks at Robert E. Lee's history during the war can see that Lee, for the first day or two of a battle, is like a very skilled boxer, throwing the punches, jabbing, moving. But by day 3, Lee goes from being the boxer to being the bully. He throws away all caution and lets his aggression get the better of him, so that he starts throwing troops into attacks that he quite frankly shouldn't make. We see that very clearly at Gettysburg on July 3rd after the battle here, but you can also see it in Lee's intentions after the Battle of Fredericksburg. We see how Lee wanted to attack Sedgwick over here and was very angry when Sedgwick got away. And then we can see how Lee wanted to attack Hooker here at this V-shaped line, and had he done so, as was pointed out earlier, it would have been a disaster, and Joe Hooker, despite all the mistakes he'd made up to this time, could have still pulled out a great Union victory. But all Hooker had to do was stay here, but he didn't do that. He retreated back across the river, and then his goal is simply to try to retrieve his reputation. He does that by basically blaming everybody except for Joe Hooker. One of the most telling things about the campaign is that Joe Hooker never wrote a report of the battle, because he couldn't explain his actions. He would have had to accept some responsibility, or at the very least make it clear to all the Army that he was a liar and a backstabber. So Hooker simply did not write a report of the battle. But again, everybody in the Army, certainly the higher ranking officers, knew that Hooker had failed miserably. I think George Armstrong Custer put it best when, speaking of Hooker's and his reputation, he said, "Hooker went up like a rocket and came down like a stick." Well, the question is, how long is the stick going to stay in command? And the answer was not too long, because just before the Battle of Gettysburg, Joe Hooker has a dispute with the War Department, and at that point offers his resignation. And at that point, the Army takes it, and George Meade is placed in command. So a new commander, a new battle in the offing, and what Meade hopes is a new result.
I've always thought that Joe Hooker makes a decision every day that loses him this battle. Yes. And there's always a pivotal moment where things could have gone differently, but he makes a choice and makes a choice and makes a choice to lose. So I'm going to do a quick roll call here. Don, I'm going to start with you. I'm going to declip your mic for just a second, though. In the interest of time, I'm going to ask everyone to come up and just give me their quick takeaway. I'm going to ask you to keep it to like 20 seconds, 30 seconds, your quick takeaway from the Chancellorsville campaign as we wrap up our coverage. So Don, what do you think we should take away from all this?
Well, what comes to mind initially is, again, this considered Robert E. Lee's greatest battle. But as we said, to be a great commander, you not only need to be a good commander yourself, but you have to face inferior opponents. And Robert E. Lee here fought an inferior opponent. And again, had Hooker done anything differently during this campaign, this probably would not be considered Robert E. Lee's greatest victory, but probably would be considered his greatest defeat. So again, reputations are sometimes built on very shaky foundations. Now, I'm not saying that Lee's was. Certainly his broad reputation is based on a very firm foundation, but here at Chancellorsville, things could have gone very wrong for him.
Very good. Don, thanks for being with us today. Steward Henderson, come on in here. My colleague from Emerging Civil War. Steward, what's the takeaway we should have from Chancellorsville?
Well, for me, I think you have a new Union Army. The Army of the Potomac is now reorganized, and they're full of pride, and they're ready to fight. Also, here, Lee loses more dead than the Union Army does, and he starts losing lots of his officers. And this trend is going to continue into Gettysburg, into Wilderness, into Spotsylvania. So it may be his biggest victory, but it's going to be a big loss for him as well.
Steward, thanks for being with us today. Sarah Kay Bierle, come on in here with us. What do you think our big takeaway from Chancellorsville should be?
I think of the quote that President Lincoln is said to have said after the Battle of Chancellorsville, "My God, what will the country say?" And I think about what happened here on the fields, in the woods that we've been walking, and you have over 30,000 casualties that happen here. That's going to reverberate all across the country, and there's going to be that loss. There's going to be rises of political movements. We see Copperheadism rising. We see opposition to the drafts, and yet we have what the soldiers say as well. The soldiers are not willing to quit the battlefield or the campaigns after this fight. They are pressing on. The Army of Northern Virginia, the Army of the Potomac will fight on many more fields. And I think just thinking about what will the country say, what will the Army say, the impact of the fight on Civil War history and the history of our country.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Certainly the soldiers leave here thinking that they weren't beaten, even if they're leaving in defeat. Because they are still ready to rumble, and you're going to see that in Gettysburg. Tim Talbott from the Central Virginia Battlefield Trust, an important preservation partner for us at the American Battlefield Trust. Thank you so much for all the work your organization has done to help save parts of this battlefield that we've been able to walk. So Tim, what do you think our takeaway from Chancellorsville should be?
So most of the viewers are probably aware of the magazine that's now defunct, Blue and Gray magazine. About 10 years ago, Frank O'Reilly did a wonderful two-part series. The first issue covered from April 29th, I think, until the 2nd, which he called the General's Battle. And then on the 3rd, he called the Soldier's Battle. And I hope people that are watching these has gotten that feeling from what we've shared with them. This chess match of the first few days, and then this Soldier's Battle, this really played out on the battlefield today on April 3rd itself.
Great. Thanks so much, Tim. Thanks for being with us. Greg Mertz, give us your thoughts. You've had a long career on these battlefields. How's that all percolated down? What should our takeaway be?
Well, I think my takeaway does deal with additional battles. Here we have the Battle of Fredericksburg and the Battle of Chancellorsville, two horrible Union defeats. And the Confederates end up doing the one thing that can really lift the morale that you had spoken about, and that is go on up to the north. The Federal troops, despite their two defeats, rally to fight on their home soil.
Great. Thanks so much, Greg. Appreciate you being with us today. And Dan Davis, come on in. What's our big takeaway? Does it involve hooves?
It does to a certain degree, but my big takeaway is sticking with the technology idea, a catapult. As Greg mentioned, twin victories here for Robert E. Lee, two massive victories, one at Fredericksburg, one here at Chancellorsville. The initiative in the Eastern Theater squarely in the hands of Robert E. Lee, and he's going to use that initiative to take the war north. And just a little over a month after this battle, the Gettysburg campaign is going to open with the Battle of Brandy Station, and that's going to harken in the better part of a month and about a week or so of very desperate fighting across Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania.
Awesome. I'm going to ask you to pass that on to our pal Kris White. Really, to me, the big takeaway from Chancellorsville is to look at the whole story. As you all know, I'm a Jackson fanboy. I'll take my hat off. And so much of our memory about Chancellorsville is focused on his story. And yet we forget the second bloodiest day of the Civil War happens right in the wake of that. There are so many tremendous stories about this battlefield, and yet Jackson's story overshadows everything. It really shaped the way this battlefield was preserved and interpreted. I urge you to look past that story because there's so much more here at Chancellorsville to discover, and it's going to lead the route north into Gettysburg in ways that will surprise many of you. With that, I'm going to ask Kris White, Deputy Director of Education for the American Battlefield Trust, to come in and take us on home. This is one of his very favorite places, and so of course he needs to have the last word. Kris, thank you so much for your work today.
Thanks, Wink. We really appreciate you hosting today. I think we need to get you that long microphone. It looks like Bob Barker. So, you know, Sarah brought up a great point. You know, Sergeant Bowen of the 12th United States Infantry said, "We did not defeat, but we were not defeated." And that's the spirit that this Army will carry forward into the Gettysburg campaign. But I think more importantly that most people look back at this as Lee's greatest victory. If we look at this in purely military terms, if we step back and we look at Jomny and Clausewitz and others and how they would kind of dissect this battle and how the modern military could dissect this battle, we would not call this Lee's perfect victory. In fact, this is a great tactical victory, absolutely on paper, but it doesn't get the Confederacy to its strategic end, and that's ultimate victory. And even if a perfect battle doesn't get you to that strategic end, it's just waste. That's what we would call it in the Army today. At the same time that this is happening, there's another campaign happening out west, and that's the Vicksburg campaign that's just kicked off. And Ulysses S. Grant is going to go and capture Vicksburg, as we know. The Chancellorsville campaign has implications on Vicksburg, where Lee wants to keep his army together. He doesn't want to ship anyone out to Vicksburg. He wants to go north towards Gettysburg. And one of the reasons he wants to go north of the Potomac is to keep that army together so that Jefferson Davis and others in the Confederacy won't send that army out to the west. Unfortunately, the short-sighted nature of the Confederate War Department, unfortunately for them, they are not going to reinforce the west with the right people at the right place at the right time or even in the right numbers. So as Robert E. Lee's chalking up great tactical victories here in the east, operationally and strategically, Ulysses S. Grant in the west is winning victory after victory, and that's how you win a war. He has bagged one army at Forts Henry and Donelson. He's about to bag another one at Vicksburg, and he'll eventually bag another one, and that'll be Lee's at Appomattox Courthouse. So when we look at this battle, it's a great tactical, on the tactical level, it's great. We can look at leadership, breakdowns, and all of the positives on both sides. But in the end, Robert E. Lee is, as Don pointed out, going to start taking off those gloves and fighting harder and harder. And most people will say that, you know, Grant's the butcher, he's unimaginative, and this, that, and the other thing. Look at the Vicksburg campaign, he's anything but that. But if you look at Robert E. Lee makes mass frontal assaults. Gaines's Mill, Malvern Hill, Gettysburg, Chancellorsville, and beyond. And that is going to cost this Army. Just to give you a breakdown over the first 13 months of the life of the Army of Northern Virginia from June 1st, 1862 until we end the Gettysburg campaign, just to give you an idea of Lee's losses. He had 92,500 men when he started on the 7 Days campaign, and he lost 23% of his army on the peninsula. 175 line officers were killed. Those are lieutenants and captains. 675 wounded, and 110 field grade officers also fell. Those are your majors, lieutenant colonels, and your colonels. If you go to the Second Manassas campaign, he lost another 19% of his army. He's also going to lose 11 regimental commanders and 726 field and line grade officers. Why am I focusing on that? Every time you have a Jackson go down, someone has to step up. And over time, the Peter principle will kick in, and people like A.P. Hill and Richard Ewell will be promoted above their grades. And that's about to happen in the midst of the Gettysburg campaign. At Antietam, he's down to 41,000 men, and he loses another 27% of his army. 836 officers fell as casualties. And then, of course, we have Chancellorsville, where he lost more than 13,000 men, 22% of his army, 9 general officers. And to break it down at the brigade level, 910 men fell out of Lane's brigade, 12 of his 13 field grade officers. Abner Perrin's brigade, which was Sam McGowan's brigade, lost 457 men, including 5 brigade commanders. And Stephen Ramseur's men, by the end of the battle, will have lost 789 men. Lee's bleeding his army white. By the time he goes north of the Potomac River and comes back, he has lost more than 91,000 men. That's almost a 1-to-1 ratio from the time he left Richmond, undertaking the command of this army in June of 1862, carries it north to Gettysburg, comes back down here. This army's been bled white. And in the meantime, nothing's been gained. We've made it to Pennsylvania, we got some supplies. We're back down to status quo, basically, early 1862-63. They'll end up down the road from us, there'll be another campaign, and we'll start off the campaigning season in 1864 with a new player on the 1864 playing field, and that will be our Ulysses S. Grant. But where's Robert E. Lee? Where is the Army of the Potomac? Down the road, not too far from where we are. So Lee has gained nothing, whereas the Southern Confederacy is falling in upon itself from the West. 64 is an election year, and it's also a year that both sides have to go for broke. But here at Chancellorsville, it's a great victory. You cannot deny that. It's beautiful on paper until you look at the nitty-gritty. And I'll add one last thing to it. Robert E. Lee complained to his officers that they had overstated their casualties at times to show that they were braver than they were, meaning that, hey, look how many men we lost in this assault, or this lost in this assault. So I don't always believe Robert E. Lee's numbers to be accurate. I think that 13,000 number is closer to 15 or 16,000. I think after Lee told folks to stop over-reporting, they started under-reporting. So think about that.
So hopefully we've given you plenty to think about here as we have explored the 160th anniversary of Chancellorsville. Go back and look at all of these videos. Be sure you share them. Be sure you like them. We've got a ton of resources available at battlefields.org so that you can explore this campaign in greater depth. You can download our Chancellorsville Battle app so you can explore these fields by yourself with the technology. It gives you some insight into the landscapes you're looking at. And of course, those landscapes are invaluable and irreplaceable. And that's why your support of battlefield preservation is so crucial, so that we can be out here and share these lands with you that you have helped save. So thank you so much for all of us as we have shared this story that we love so much with you. We hope you've learned to love it a little as well. I'm Chris Mackowski for the American Battlefield Trust. Thank you for all you do to support battlefield preservation and education.